introduction for Scott Hayes. Scott is probably known to a lot of you. In a brief few years that he's been associated with the Smithsonian, he's been able to make the rounds and meet many people here. He kind of learned from Noel Broadbent about, the getting people out of their offices and being a connector of people and finding out what's going on. Scott hasn't been around, in residence that long, but while he's been here, he's been very active, has got to know a lot of people, has learned to use our archives and our collections. And so he's here now for a couple more months. He's a research associate in the Arctic Studies Center. He came to that position via his PhD work for McGill at McGill, at least partly at McGill. Was it all McGill?
Yeah, mostly McGill.
Mostly
yeah.
McGill.
Yeah.
In Ungava, where he did work among the Inuit of northern Ungava. He's got a really varied background, not only accomplished in anthropology, but a lot of training in architecture and landscape work. And I've seen some wonderful plans that he's done about for virtual museums in the north. And he's been, of course, most recently acclaimed because of his publication with Chris Helgen of Lucian Turner's manuscripts on mammals, which lay fallow in our archives for 125 years, 30 years, or something like that. And they brought this book together, using our collections and archival data. It's a wonderful book and a lot of local input from the people he knows in the Ungava region. So he's really, he's done a great job. I don't know anything about what happens down south. We'll find out more about that, today, mapping the unseen. And he's at Canberra. He's had a couple of different jobs down there, most recently at Canberra. What's your actual title?
Assistant Professor in Cultural Heritage at the University of Canberra.
Scott.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Bill. Wonderful. Yeah.
Thank you for being here and helping us.
No worries. Well, thanks everyone for coming along today and sparing your lunch, and I'll hopefully whet your appetite with a little bit of information about the southern part of this world. And many of you may have actually travelled to Australia before, but the place I'm going to talk about today is in South Australia. Actually, my home state. I grew up in South Australia on a farm north of Adelaide, about an hour north of Adelaide. But the place I'm going to be talking about today is about 6 hours north of Adelaide, which is the capital of South Australia. And it's near the Victorian South Australian border. And just to extend a little bit more on my biography that Bill introduced me with, my formal training is actually in landscape architecture and architecture. And I still teach in that area. I actually teach design studio. And some of you may not be familiar with a design studio format. It's a little bit different than seminars. Basically, it's an experiment, if you like. We test ideas, very liberal thinking. We draw in literature, current literature in the field. It brings in the research that the lecturer is working on. And my approach is actually to get students into the field and learn firsthand from experience. So this project I'm going to present today has nothing to do with the Canadian Arctic, where I've spent a fair chunk of my time and thinking. But it does represent the last 5 years of research down in South Australia, another field site, if you like. So the title of my talk today, Mapping the Unseen Landscape, and I want you to think about this as I go through my slides. The unseen, what I'm going to be referring to here is the intangible qualities of landscape. That are things that are there, present, but not often talked about, sometimes unspoken because they're sacred places, secret places, personal places, place names that were known but no longer used, those sorts of things. So that's what it refers to. And I'm using the subtitle here, Participatory Mapping. But in a way, I'd like you to think about this project I'm going to present in terms of counter mapping, which is a relatively new concept in geography and anthropology. And counter mapping by its very nature is to go against the grain. So if you think about how pervasive GPS, Google Maps is in this world, this project was really to try and unpack that thinking about seeing the landscape amongst a group of students and people we're working with, getting to rethink landscape differently. So I'll proceed here to give you an introduction about the geography first of all. So the homeland I'm talking about is called the Boandik homeland. In Australia there are about 200 different Aboriginal homelands. This represents one of them. There's a famous anthropologist, Norman Tyndale, and he was the first to map out these different homeland regions. So today the parlance in Australia is to talk about them as homelands, sometimes in terms of country. They use simultaneously like that, but you'll hear me go back and forth between those terms. It's really interesting. There were 200 homelands when Tyndale was doing his research, 50, 60 years ago, even a little bit before that. And along with that, there were languages associated with each of those homelands. But as European settlement progressed in Australia, that had an impact on the Aboriginal people, their language and connections to country, and it actually impacted the amount of Aboriginal languages we have today in Australia too. And the Boandik homeland is one homeland that was affected by this. Today it's a very fragmented community. It's not like you see in northern parts of Australia where people are living on country, hunting and fishing and camping. Here people are living in towns, in modern towns. They're scattered right across the state, even interstate, but they still very much have spiritual and personal ties to this country. So there's very interesting characteristics about this place. It's often called the Kakadu of the South because it was known for how wet the ground was. And when the Europeans settled there in about the 1840s, it was actually the Scottish that first arrived. They had trouble getting around farming. They were typically farming how they farmed back in Scotland, and they just discovered it was impossible to actually make this land work. So what they did was develop some drainage schemes, which is still in existence today, to drain the Boandik homeland of its water. And it might be seen as a scar on the landscape, if you like, and that comes into the narrative we're going to talk about soon. But this draining effectively reshaped the Boandik homeland 150, 180 years ago, and it continues to be reshaped today. It's one of the biggest drainage schemes ever implemented in Australia. There's 2,000 or 3,000 miles of drains, cuttings, reshaping of wetlands and so on to effectively generate dry ground. So the Boandik name actually means the people of the reeds. So that harkens back to this wetness of the place, if you like, and it's ironic that it doesn't have that same feeling about it today. The other thing that really characterised this place, I want to go through the geography first before we're going to get into the mapping, just to give you a sense of the place. It's full of limestone caves and actually features some really old rock art, and they believe it's up to 10,000 years old, some of the earliest forms of rock art in Australia. And there's what's called finger fluting, evidence where the early Boandik people, or maybe the people before them, went in and made scratchings on the inside of these caves, and that's suggested as an early form of rock art. But on the right-hand side here of the slide, you can see other forms that developed over time. There's these concentric rings and other patterns that resemble emu feet and tracks of kangaroos and so forth. So I had an opportunity to bring some students in on this project. The other thing that characterises this place, so we've got small sinkholes and then we've got large ones, and the big township that is the centre of Boandik country is Mount Gambier. It's considered a city. It's a very pretty city. It's based around a volcano, and right in the middle of town they have a garden, a cave garden. It's quite spectacular. It's a European style garden, but it actually has Boandik roots to it. So these are very important to the people there. And this is big timber country. Given how wet it was, the timber that you see in front of you is called Eucalyptus camaldulensis. It's a river red gum. It's a beautiful stand of timber. The one pictured here could be 500, 600 years old. And unfortunately, when the government embarked on these drainage schemes, they ring-barked many of these trees because they saw them as taking up too much water. But as we'll see in slides further on, this tree is extremely important to the Boandik people for a number of reasons. Another feature of the geography is this beautiful coastline. It's a few hundred kilometres of coastline, and you see here in front of you Aboriginal middens. They're strewn all the way along the countryside, also in the interior, but these ones by the coast are extremely impressive. And interestingly, a lot of the shells that are in the middens, oysters and scallops and other things, are no longer out there in the sea. So they represent a time previous to the Boandik people there today. So it shows the occupation of this place has been going on for at least, upwards of 40,000 years. So a very old landscape. And this here is a slide showing you what it looks like where these wetlands have been drained, reconfigured. So much of the landscape as you drive through it today appears like this. So the project was really interesting. I collaborated with the Boandik community through an organisation called the Southeast Aboriginal Focus Group. And they're a peak organisation in this Boandik region who represent the Boandik people and other Aboriginal people who also live on country. These are non-Boandik people that are accepted by the community. We work with the Natural Resource Management, the state government arm of resource management, National Parks and Wildlife, the Heritage and Cultural Unit, and our university, the University of Canberra, and a number of other agencies, including the City of Mount Gambier, who helped sponsor this project. So the goal was to, given that this is quite a fragmented community where people living off country, there is this renaissance or this revival going on within the community amongst many community members who want to relive some of the past, relearn about that, and also get it out there amongst the non-Aboriginal people of the area. Because there's quite a sense in the community that there are no Aboriginal people there anymore. And in fact, there's a lot of material that you can find locally that says the last Boandik person died, in 1910 and he's buried here and so forth. So that particular piece of information has continued generation by generation. So these people living there think that there's no longer an Aboriginal landscape present. But in fact there very much is, and this project was to try and highlight how important that landscape is today in this fragmented sense, and that the non-Aboriginal people may have a lot to learn about the Boandik connection to it as well. So it was very much a creative exercise, and I had to do a lot of reading about what counter mapping is, what participatory mapping is, because it's not something we engage with very much in Australia. So it was this experiment in a design studio. So here I am, I bring 18 students to the field, working with these community members that I've already established relationships with, and we embarked on a week-long journey, walking the landscape, seeing the landscape, and talking to one another and sharing stories and ideas. And it's through this collaboration we're able to develop some counter maps. So the way to frame this approach, we had to break down this landscape setting. It's enormous. And I couldn't have 18 students with me just logistically and take them around to different sites. So what we arranged was that Mount Gambier here is sort of the heart of the Boandik homeland, that we use a spoke and hub approach to breaking up the landscape. And that we had 6 groups, 3 students in each, and they were joined with hosts from the community who knew about different parcels of these geographies. So some through the forest and wetlands, some down to the coast, some through the sinkholes and volcanoes, and some up into some other cave and wetland areas. So we were able to join forces with people who knew this country well, and then we set them on task. So you'll hear me talk about transects quite a bit, and that refers to the breaking up of this division of land to go and see it. So it's just an arbitrary way, but it was actually discussed in advance with the Boandik community before we embarked on this study. So all the steps along the way, there was some discussion about this. It's really hard for students these days in design schools to think about landscapes at a landscape scale. They're very good at working you know, in a backyard sense and a parkland sense, but you throw them into environment and you ask them to map something that's 50 kilometres long, they have a real challenge in doing that. So I set them on some tasks before we got into the field about how they might be able to do this. One thing I told them was, you know, abandon your GPS. This is a chance where you're going to feel the ground, you're going to smell the places, you're going to get out of the car and take little tangents off of this transect. That's how you're going to see it. You're going to follow what your guides are going to you know, show you. They're going to know the places and you have to listen. This is quite a bit of a challenge for some of them, but they really got a hang of it. There's a way of doing business, they call it business in Aboriginal cultures in Australia, and particularly the Boandik people have a very strong structure about how you carry out business in their homeland. By business I mean this project forms business to them. It's an interrogation of their country, and it's a collaboration, and we all have to work together. And they have a framework they call the 3 message stick cultural governance framework. And it's broken down into ceremony and talk, hunt and gather, and song and dance. And the way it works is that you have to go through these stages bit by bit, and if you have trouble with one stage, you then go back to the next stage until everyone feels comfortable, and then you progress. So there's no rush in getting to the final endpoint or agreed goals. And we, as a group, discussed what these different components were. So ceremony and talk was coming up with the idea, going down, meeting each other, even before we brought the students down to the field, which is about a 3-hour flight from Canberra to this place. And then we discussed that we wanted to have some cultural mapping products, counter mapping products at the end. So the hunt and gather was the students and the host doing the work, going out there, telling the stories, collecting that. And then the song and dance was the celebration at the end, where we exhibited the works to the public, and in fact the works are still on tour today, going around the area. So there are 3 different components, and in fact the local government agencies have now taken this up as a way to work with the Boandik community, and are even adopting this in some of their other business that they do that doesn't relate to Aboriginal culture. It's just a neat way of going about it. So this you see in front of you is some of that ceremony and talk. So we have a smoking ceremony, the students all stand in a circle, an elder goes around, and everyone has to, you know, take that in, the smoke, and it's cleansing, getting rid of the bad spirits and the bad feelings, and it's an acknowledgement to country as well. And here we are in very informal settings. It's actually great to be talking in these places, like a shearing shed. You know, everything and anything is possible when you're out in the countryside. So here we're telling each other about who we are, what we do. You must share who you are. You're going to become part of this project. You have to give something and get something out of it too. And then after discussion, you know, in these spaces we go and we talk again on country, and basically getting to know each other. And I had a lot of students in my class who were international students. So I had some from China, Vietnam, Korea. They really got a lot out of this project. And to them, this is what they said to me, this was their first real introduction to Australia. They'd only ever spent time in cities, and they got a sense that this is what they'd heard about. And they really went home to their home countries with a different sense of who they are, and also a different appreciation of Indigenous people in their cultures. Because a few of the Chinese students in the class mentioned that you know, they've been brought up to think that there are no Indigenous people in China. So some of these projects have unintended consequences, and quite profound consequences at times. So the elders were good in that they did some fun things. You know, they showed the students how to throw a boomerang and whatever, play the didgeridoo. And you know, here we are again in different settings. So we're getting them out of their element. The classroom is one place, but this is the real classroom. You know, this is where it all goes on. So the first thing I did is before taking students to the field, I said, I've already been there, I've met these people, we've got hosts set up who are going to look after you in 3 weeks' time, but you must do some readings about cultural mapping, ways of seeing and knowing landscapes, readings on senses of place, and readings on landscape representation. And I threw it at them. I had a design tutor help me, and we said, if you don't take on this challenge, you're really going to struggle in the field. Everything's going to seem really foreign to you. It was anyway. And what I had them do was make these maquettes, and we use them sometimes in design. The brief here was, I said they had to make this maquette, which is a working model, if you like, of such a size, such a dimension. It had to incorporate readings about landscape representation, cultural mapping, and they had to pick one element of the Boandik homeland that they'd received from their readings or something done from a desktop review. So this is without engagement with the people. The one you see on the left here is, so these are done within 3 weeks. The students have put these together and they are exhibited at our university. This one represents Craig Ball, who is a legendary figure in the Boandik cosmology. And Craig Ball is telling a story about the volcanoes, the transformation of the landscape. So what you see here, the different colours of the cloth, is the different fire coming through of the volcano, and then he is said to be a giant, and what you see here is his arms out and he's supporting this landscape. So it's coming from the earth up. The one on the left hand side represents the coming together of European settlement and the Aboriginal people, that transition. There's a message in the bottle. It's symbolic in that, you know, there's something about the past and present in there. You're really not sure what it is, but it washes up on the beach, and, you know, someone would find that. And here it is, this first contact even before white people have even come into this landscape. So the students came up with some wonderful maquettes. The one on the left-hand side was done by my Korean student who was a florist before becoming a designer, and she weaved together this beautiful nest. And it represented to her some readings on important birds and the gathering of resources in the Boandik landscape. And the one on the left-hand side represents a rabbit trap, and if anyone's done a little bit of research about Australia, how rabbits just rampaged, you know, the countryside and ripped it to shreds, but it was still a very important food to the Boandik people, as it was to many Aboriginal groups. And you're not allowed to trap anymore in Australia, so you find these as relics on the landscape. But they have this connection between European culture and Aboriginal culture. And another student represented here in their model the layers of the water landscape. So I mentioned the wetlands earlier. This one's talking about this deep volume of water. When we went down in the caves, we got a sense of that water table as well, and how I mentioned before the Boandik name is the people of the reeds, so they're very much connected to water. So this was an exploration of place and space through making something. This is before they've even gone to the field to meet people, because I was throwing them in the deep end. And so then we arrive on the project proper. And we called it Windows into Boandik Country, Transect's Windows into Boandik Country. So I had 3 students on one of the transects head to the beach, and they spent 5 days working with knowledgeable people, some Aboriginal elders, some not, about the Boandik knowledge of seasons. And this represents a seasonal calendar. And I gave them some guidelines. The models that they had to make were 2.4 metres by 1.2, and that was a volumetric dimension, and they had to be creative with that. So you'll see that that dimension's been used in different ways. So here they've used the going around in the 2.4 metres and 1.2 metres high. And it was suspended from above, and they had a projector set inside, and on the ground it had the different names for the Boandik seasons. And if you spun this, it would move around. And on there are the moths and fishes and other things that was important and continues to be important to the Boandik people. So that was their take, that was their map of country. So here we are using map in a very different sense than what you're used to. And I'll talk about how this stuff was received at the end. So this is the sort of environment that those students were walking in to come up with that. The second one, another transect, this one going through more wetland country and sinkhole countryside. What they did was they did some drawings when they sat out there with their hosts of certain places of importance to the people there. And then they did research about what these places might have looked like before European settlement. And they juxtaposed these on a large panel. What you see here is the making of this. This is the panel here. So again, you're thinking 2.4 metres, it's quite a large panel, it's very heavy. And what they did was they made these pieces using electric router, and so they turned their sketches into digital form, and the machine cut out their sketches onto the wood. The wood they use is local wood from the region, so it has a connection back to the place. And here is a play on the European way of seeing the Aboriginal people, the use of the old plaster frame around this with the gold plating. You might see like fox hunting, in the valley or something. This idea that Aboriginal people were seen in a certain way, and maybe so even today by some people. So this is more of a close-up, and these stories on there represent quotes or notes that they took when they were in the field with their hosts. And one of them is really striking. It says, a country with fences has lost its spirit. And that really resonated a lot with the people who came along to see these when this was exhibited. So you open this handle, and inside is either another quote or another drawing representing that place in a different time period, how it changed. So these students had about 8 weeks to make these maps. I'm using the word maps because they are. Maps are about a place, What is a map? It doesn't necessarily have to tell you to get from A to B. It tells you about what a place is like as well. So here they are bringing out the qualities of this space along that transect. And there's clever use of the black and the white and so forth too. There's many different layers of information here. The next transect, the students were going through countryside like this. There's now huge stands of Pinus radiata in this country, and then you see here these little wetlands or sinkholes left over, and there's a lot of names attached to this in Boandik culture. These are done by my Chinese students who had to struggle with what Aboriginal culture was all about to begin with, but I take my hat off to them. They came up with something quite clever. Being crafted with these dimensions given to them, they made a box, and you could press the outside of this box and out would come the panels, and it would reveal the landscape over time. So you see these different layers of occupation of Boandik use of these landscapes. And on the top, this transparent sheet, they've done research on the Boandik names for certain places, and it also represents their journey map that they took with the people. So it's highly personalised. And there's a bit more of an overview of their work. So you see here how they learned a little bit of cabinet making, and it's got these beautiful little buttons you press on the side and out it comes. So again, there's different layering and being very clever with the use of that. You remember the slide I showed at the beginning of these river red gums, these grand trees? Well, the Boandik people use them for a number of resources, making boomerangs out of them, shields, and they also made bark canoes. And there's a project on right now to revitalise the making of these bark canoes in Boandik culture. It's called Yuki, Y-U-K-I, Yuki. And this one here was the first one made in about 100 years. And my students got a chance to see this. They didn't see the making of it. It had only been made a year or two previous, but we got to work with people who were involved in its making. And this was the tree on the left-hand side that this was taken from. So these river red gums populate the landscape, and as you drive along, you see ones like on the left there. So these are like sentinels on the landscape. They're reminders of the past, and if someone didn't explain it to you, you would think it's just a scar on the tree that's occurred through fire or some other damage. But in fact, most of them have been made for for utility, for shields, boomerangs, and for these canoes. So the student group working on this particular transect actually came up with 2 maps for it. And the first one they did was using the inside of, I'll show you, this was the product they came up with. These represent the major nodes along the way that they stopped on their journey with their host. And here they've got photographs that they've had etched onto plastic, and lighting would show through to talk about these special places. This has got a really interesting story about it. The students, were taken by these trees, but one of the students back in Canberra, he grew up on a farm, and he still has contact with that farm, and his father said, well, we've got some old trees out in the paddock that might sort of be useful in telling your story, and they brought in this piece of timber. It's enormous. You almost need a forklift to get it into the design studio. And I said, look, if it falls over, it's going to hurt someone. So we had to cut it in 2 just to make it manageable. But they had it sitting in the design studio, and then one night, one piece of it was pinched, the top part of it. And they're, oh no, this is not going to happen, a week out of it being due. I said, no, this is a perfect opportunity to make it even better. So we worked together and came up with this idea that we put galvanised iron over the remaining section that was broken. And galvanised iron in Aboriginal culture in Australia is a really important building material for shelter, has heaps of utility. So it was very much connected to this idea of shelter, where some of these trees in this area were actually used as homes too. Sometimes up to 10 people could live inside one of the trunks of these trees. So this is an interesting use of materiality in the telling of the story. So here we are, we have them mapped through the landscape. It's on the type of surface. It has that texture, and when it was lit up, it really glowed. But I just wanted to show you a couple of slides on how this was made. It's a bit of a challenge working with this sort of material. And this was the other transect map that they made. One of the group members had located a pallet of these blue gum veneers, and he put this together as a mosaic based on the track that they did, and he overlaid that on top of it. It's quite a clever little piece. So again, just another way of interpreting that space. For the next transect, these students, I think, had some really wonderful hosts who just gave them so much time that they even took them into their households, gave them bottles of wine and whatever, and became good friends with the students. And it showed in the quality of the work and the amount of commitment they put to the project. So this was their mud map, if you like, as they went through, and I didn't see some of this material until the end. The students all had to keep logs and journals along the way, and this is what appeared in it. But it helped them frame the making of their transect map. And here is the piece that they came up with. They called it Chromolite Menindi, which means red mud in Boandik language. And the red mud is in reference to these channels that were carved through the landscape to drain the water away. And you can see it here. So they're talking about them as fissures in the landscape, if you like, compartmentalising it, breaking it up. This is full of information, this map. It was carefully crafted on a big piece of paper and then transferred into digital form for routers to make in a workshop. But the slab itself, again, represents the River Red Gum countryside that they went through. They found a piece that had a hole in it, and for them that represented one of the major wetlands. And you see upright there's 3 sticks. And building on the message stick protocols that have been introduced to us, the students took that on and they asked their hosts whether or not it would be appropriate to make message sticks themselves. And they said indeed. So what they did is it actually represents their hands on the stick. So one of the Thai students, she's a very tiny lady, it's a tiny stick there. So that's her piece within the map. Again, it's been highly personalised. And the scribble on the top of the board is the story that the students wrote as they moved from place to place over the days. And they were dealing with a coastal environment, and they really wanted to show how the sand dunes have moved very much so over the last 10 to 20,000 years. And to them, that these markings on those translucent panels, when lit up, represent that transportation of sand and the movement of the landscape. It was quite a powerful piece and very carefully done in the lab. And there's a bit of a close-up of what it looks like. So they had really had to calibrate these routers to make sure that they didn't lose their words. And inset in these sections are special places that they were taken to, and they collected material from the site, and that was embossed in using epoxy resins and other things. Here's a bit of a close-up of some of those translucent panels that they made. Now the last transect, this one was called Sweet Waters. Really interesting group dynamics here. A Korean student working with a Chinese student and a local student from Canberra. And they worked non-stop in the studio, well beyond what they needed to do to make this map. I mean, they were giving so much to it because they saw the importance of it as a project. And I'd find them really early in the morning, even late at night, all high on paint fumes or whatever. And here they are, and they actually kept it as a surprise to me. Every time I come in, they try and they distract me. They didn't want me to see it because they knew there'd be some grand reveal. And but I was fortunate to see it progress along the way. Their site centred on Bull Lagoon, a very famous water body in the south of Australia, not just within South Australia. It's a place where migratory birds from Alaska and China come to and fatten up and then make their way back. It was also a meeting ground of the Boandik group and then the neighbouring groups, the Nurringerri and Gungit and Murra groups and some other groups nearby. So there's not a lot of actual physical signs that people were here moving about this place, but the oral stories are certainly there on how important it was. So a major gathering ground for animals and hunting, and then as this peaceful place where trade was done and where conflicts were resolved and marriage and so forth. We know that this was an important setting. So armed with all this information, the students decided to generate on their map an Earth Mother figure. And here she is where you can't tell her identity. You don't know whether she's black or white. The strands of their hair represent the three different Aboriginal groups that will come together. So there's this weaving in of the space. And the fetus that you see growing and glowing inside is meant to represent a new era for this place, this setting, that there's a sense of hope that if this place is managed properly, if people are good to one another, this unborn child, not knowing whether they're Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal, will come into this much better world. So there's a sense that Bull Lagoon as a place, symbolically here, has an opportunity to make us reconnect. And they really wanted to get that message across. It was quite a strong message too. So they had this lit up with a lamp behind, and then it would also close too, so people could come up to it and see open and close, and it had that dynamic aspect about it. But here you see this is the Scottish settlers. They're bringing in their sheep. The tartan pattern you see here, they did research and actually represents the patterns from the local area in Scotland where these people came from. And in the background you see some of the old survey lines of the country when the Europeans arrived. Here we have some place names in Aboriginal language that have been placed onto the map. And also you see the use of feathers here. Well, feathers because Bull Lagoon attracts thousands and thousands of birds. And also it's playing again with Craigbull, the legend about Craigbull and the red and the sulphur-crested cockatoo forms very much a part of this story. And you see that coming in here. So you see the students have taken on all this information and they've tried to jam-pack it in, but at the same time keep on message with what the project's about. They've had to work within these dimensions given to them a major creative exercise, and I think that just about all of them pulled it off extremely well. So that performed the, we've gone through the hunting and gathering. This is the doing part. And then this is the song and dance at the end. So we transport all this material from Canberra in a truck, and we spent 3 days setting it up in Mount Gambier, and we invited the Boandik community and the other people we engaged with to be part of this exhibition opening. The City of Mount Gambier offered their major gallery space, which was wonderful. It was a beautiful space for it. It was set in the evening in summertime, and there was just a peaceful feel about this exhibition, something that had not ever been done before. And one of the Boandik elders sort of remarked in my ear and saying, that this is history in the making right here. He was saying that this is still us. It's equivalent of an artefact in the ground. This is Boandik culture. And it was a way, I guess, to demonstrate to the non-Aboriginal community a little bit more about this Aboriginal connection to landscape, that there still are these stories that are there, and this is one way of representing it. And there's plenty of other ways, of course. But so the Boandik elders actually was significant exhibition. They spent some time constructing a welcome to country, acknowledgement to country in Boandik language, a language that hasn't been spoken for 100 odd years. So they got together and they said that in language, which was really important, and there were a lot of tears in people's eyes seeing this happen, this coming together of different groups. And they took ownership of it. So I'm happy to say that this project you've seen in front of you is still on exhibit. This was exhibited in December 2013, and it's gone right around the country, throughout the Boandik homeland, and even now beyond that into different places. So it's reached a huge audience. Certainly thousands of people who have encountered it. And when we had the opening, there were school teachers there, art teachers and so on, who really wanted to know more about how we went about this project. So I guess this is sort of the closing of it, if you like. This was our song and dance. It still continues, and we're now working on different projects together. But it's been a wonderful relationship and really important to me, because it's so hard in a university setting to conduct research these days that's connected to teaching, and this is, I think, a model for how we conduct research-led teaching. And just as a side note, we did win 2 awards for this project. We won an award called the NAIDOC Award through the local partner, David New, and I won a Diversity and Equity Award through our Vice-Chancellor at the University of Canberra recently for this project. So it has got broad acknowledgement, and it is serving as a model for other Aboriginal communities in Australia, especially those in a fragmented sense, to reawaken it, get people talking again. We had this in the media, we were on the local radio, we had it throughout the papers, and there was a lot of discussion. But more than that, the farmers that were involved with this were saying, we see that these river red gums are really quite important, and we knew that already, but I guess they're there and it's part of your farm, and you sort of forget how much it is important to other people. And many of them are committed to saying we're going to fence off some of these areas or protect stock from damaging them, and also to help the young river red gums come along, the saplings, because that is the new generation, that is the new part of this ongoing activation of the Boandik landscape. So certainly the hosts who were involved had this, had an effect on them too. So I just want to close with this statement about heritage in the making, because I think it is quite important, and something we often overlook with these contemporary projects, is that, as I mentioned before, this is, to the Boandik people, this is just as important to them. And when you think about how the Boandik people think about time as well, in that the Dreamtime stories happened a long time ago, but they're just as relevant today, these stories that were told to us are just like that. They're as old and they're as young as they are today. So we were very lucky to be involved, and I really want to thank my partners again for the opportunity to be part of it. Thank you very much. Now, before I go to question, I'd like to play one song that the students made as part of this, because it's just something a little bit different, and it only goes for about a minute. So is that all right? We'll see how we go here.
This is not the place I was expecting. This is not exactly what I thought I would see. I didn't see a bird-filled paradise, yet it's not quite as simple as I thought it would be. I stepped at the door into a chill. I walked upon a path that led me through the lagoon. Couldn't see the birds for all the tea tree, but then came the lookouts, and well, you know what I mean.
There you go. Just a nice way to finish. Yeah. Bit of a Zen moment. Again, another form of mapping, isn't it? Sound mapping. These are beautiful things you get from students sometimes who put in the extra effort. It wasn't part of the assessment, but to get something original like that. And when we played that at the exhibition with the Boandik community, you can imagine how many tears were rolling down their eyes when this is someone who's interpreted their place and done it in a loving way. Anyway, I'm happy to take some questions. I'm sure you've got some things you would like to ask. Yeah?
I have two questions. You mentioned that you had previously selected folks that you were working with out in the field.
Yeah.
And so my first question is, how were those folks chosen? And then secondly, were the students assisted in any way with the creation of their physical maps with anybody from the community, from the Indigenous communities themselves, and doing it?
Yeah, good questions. Yeah, so in terms of setting up arrangements with the host, I have been working down in this area for a number of years before taking on this project. I had to meet some people for the first time, and I did that over the phone, but I did a preliminary visit and I went out to meet people personally. And it was really actually quite difficult to explain what the intent of the project was, because you don't know what the outcome's going to be. And then there's a lot of faith there, but through goodwill, it worked out really well. So yes, that was made possible through previous connections. And I must say, to embark on such a thing, you need to have that solid footing, that level of trust. And if that's not there, I don't think these projects are even feasible. The second part of your question about whether there was involvement from the communities in the making, not so much. There was some back and forth dialogue. Basically, when the students formed this connection with their hosts, it was up to them to keep that going. I facilitated it from time to time when I thought they were going in the wrong direction with their thoughts, because I was also very aware that what they produced had to be sensitive to, Boandik people, and make sure there wasn't an appropriation of culture that was inappropriate. So there was certainly dialogue via email and phone, but nothing in terms of people coming across. A financial restriction, unfortunately. Canberra and Mount Gambier are some distance away from each other. But I'd have to say, when this was presented at exhibition, there was no comment whatsoever about this not representing them. In fact, it was when people saw it, well, this is us, I think that's quite telling of the success of that relationship. Yeah, thank you. Gwen?
So it's less of a question. First of all, I really enjoyed the talk. And then also to say that I think certainly within anthropology, it can be quite difficult for anthropologists to communicate experiential knowledge in an experiential way.
Yeah.
Which is effectively what this project does.
Yeah.
Because the students, as you said, they're all building themselves into the story, so they're not just translating someone else's story.
No.
So they put themselves in the picture, so it's really very much their experiences
Yeah.
of the landscape. But then the way in which it's exhibited, I think, is really important. We always forget that, because then it goes into the public space, then it becomes another experience. It's kind of building a public
Yeah.
experience of this landscape. So it's a really effective method.
just to build on that, the reason I set dimensions quite large for these maps is so that they would exist as a body of works. If they were just smaller pieces, they might have got lost in the corner of a room. Here they had profound impact. When you walked in, they were quite stark and striking. And they must travel together as a set because they're a collective part. Each transect represents a whole of that space. But I guess this is where I'm able to bring in some of my design skills and anthropological skills and start to test the waters on the possibilities of anthropology. If we start to work more in these areas, you know, who knows what area we're going to get into. So I'm saying it's such an experiment, but you can see that the community love it. So they're the audience that we're working with, and it gets people thinking about landscape and place and spirituality again. So maybe this is a medium that does work. Who knows? Yes. No, at the back. Yep, thank you.
You mentioned the possibility of the creation of a cultural center.
Yes.
Do you plan on training native members of the community to do this kind of work? So it will be their own interpretation of their world.
Yeah.
Of course, no matter how accepting their artworks,
Yeah.
your work, it's still an interpretation by outsiders of their
Yeah.
native culture.
That's
I was
true.
wondering if people from the community have access to that kind of education, so in the future they can be the ones or
Yeah.
train themselves to the outside world.
Yeah. I mentioned at the start that the Boandik community is quite small. I don't want to say how many people there are because there's no real statistics on that, but let's say it's a few hundred people. And some people are just learning that they have Boandik ancestry today through genealogy and so forth. So that community is growing in a sense. We were able to attract some other funding as part of this with the exhibit moving on, and that's now being used to help train some of the Boandik people in the community to develop up their skills in curating and holding these sorts of exhibits. Some of them are indeed artists in their own right, and I guess what we did was just stimulated that sort of that forum for these things to happen. I didn't mention anything about this cultural centre that they're trying to build in the community, but part of our aim was to drive the conversation behind that, to get the community to say it's time now for the Aboriginal people to be recognised in this area by some sort of centre or keeping place or whatever you want to call it, and this was part of that push. And now it's up to others to take that on. But I have to say, all the way along, we worked with the right people and agencies and elders and so forth, and they never said that this is white folks' work. This was still our work, you know, and a lot of them wanted to keep these pieces that we made and take home, you know, that's how much they were loved. So, but you're spot on. I think that's the next stage, is to attract funding, and that's the sort of thing we're working on with government to try and do that. Thank you. Jordan? Yeah.
What with the pieces, what sort of guide, were there any guidelines given? And I'm just very curious about those. Like,
Yeah,
were
so
they just given, or were the students given
no restrictions on the use of materials. The only restriction was on size and portability, in that they had to be able to be collapsible somehow or other. Otherwise they'd break our backs carrying these things around. So yeah, very open, and as you can see, these things evolve. In 8 or 9 weeks, some of them started out with very different ideas, and I was guiding them along with my design tutor, and we'd help them a little bit, saying, what about this, never really telling them how to do it. So there's a sense of my work in this here too, along with my design tutor. It's a team effort, yeah.
Yeah, thank
Josh.
you. I guess I have a two-part question. One is, because I think we learn from our mistakes a lot,
Yeah.
particularly when doing field work. So I was wondering what frictions or mistakes emerged during your project that you're doing the transects
Yeah.
that you've learned from. And then the second part is, I know you're doing new work in Fiji. Are you exporting this model to
Yeah.
there, or are you thinking that you're going to go back to this locality with a
Yeah.
bunch of students and create a new map? So
Yeah.
what's the kind of future?
So in terms of mistakes, it's a good point. I took students to this area again last year, and we took 2 filmmakers with us, and we attempted to use film as the medium to talk about, you know, the importance of the Boandik landscape. And what I realised out of that experience is that there are technical challenges with working with film, And even though design students can be very creative in many areas, filmmaking is obviously a very specific discipline. So, and I found that some of the use of the footage that students chose was at times probably not the appropriate use of that footage, so it couldn't be conveyed back to the community. So I guess each medium has its own merits. That's one thing I learned. I think that it's important to keep maintaining relationships with these communities. You don't drop in and drop out. This was a 3-year build-up. You know, it's many long discussions on car rides about what are we going to do, and we'll keep toying with new ideas, but eventually try and get this cultural centre built. And as the gentleman was saying at the back there, if we can start to build the local skill base for that to occur, then gives even better reason for it to happen. But in terms of translating this into the Fijian context, absolutely, but the groundwork isn't there yet. So it's certainly years down the track before that would occur. I've been thinking about this in terms of the work I do in the Arctic, but there's just challenges in. I think it's really wonderful to have students work with this because their eyes are wide open, They don't have these disciplines that they come from. There's no real constraints, only their assignment constraints and finances. But yeah, it would be great to see this happen in other contexts for sure.